I'm Veronica Post, author of Hot To Trot, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Veronica Post about her graphic novel, Hot To Trot, from Conundrum Press. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. And if you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Veronica Post is an award-winning graphic novelist and multidisciplinary artist based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She attended university for philosophy and fine arts before moving to Montreal, where she completed her studies in cabinet making and discovered the DIY culture of self-published zines. She joined a zine distro and began creating comics while following a path towards becoming a furniture maker. Her path took a turn when she left Montreal for the allure of travel. She spent 8 years exploring Canada, America, and Eastern Europe, where she began working on what would become Fugitive Days. Today, she continues to create comics based on her life with her characters Langosh and Peppy. Hot To Trot is a story of Langosh and Eva as they embark on an epic cross-country journey. They discover that old wounds and differing personal experiences have begun to threaten their close-knit friendship. The landscape of America creates a constantly evolving backdrop to their emotional voyage. As they explore big cities, small towns, prairies, and mountains, Langosh opens up to Eva about his experience of police brutality, and the stark difference between how they respond to the situation leads to a deep reflection on how the past informs their current choices. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Veronica Post about her graphic novel Hot To Trot from Conundrum Press. So, Veronica Post, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time. Before we get started with all the questions, I want to ask you, what was the first comic book that you read?
Well, I think probably the first thing that comes to mind is Calvin and Hobbes. I loved Calvin and Hobbes. Growing up, I collected all of the books that I could. Whenever there was a Scholastic book fair that came to my school, I would always immediately want to buy the newest Calvin and Hobbes collection. So that was probably the biggest influence on me. I also read a lot of Archie comics, and those were kind of more like, for me anyway, even as a kid, I was like, the Archie comics, they're not quite as sophisticated. They're more like, like junk food, but I loved those too. So those are the two big ones that I loved as a kid.
Yeah, they're very popular. I've got the Calvin Hobbes collection here. So that was the little subtle messages in there too, beyond just like a kid having fun. Whereas Archie, you're right, it's just pablum, I guess. It's just like something to read,
Yeah, I haven't actually tried to reread any Archies as an adult. I should give it a try and see if there's anything in there that I would still like. I mean, aside from the artwork, which I think is pretty good in a lot of them, especially some of the older ones. But the Calvin and Hobbes was just so, like, even now when I read them, I just love them so much. The characters are so good. Calvin's, like, just the balance of, like, between Calvin's just, like, intense, wild, just kind of off the wall kind of behavior. And then Hobbes is just, like, such a perfect balance to that. I just really love them.
Yeah, great books growing up for sure. Who or what inspires you to create today?
Well, I think I gained inspiration from a lot of places. I was really into especially in my early 20s and 20s, I got really into sort of like the punk DIY subculture. And that was a big inspiration for me because I kind of like was interested in it when I lived in Halifax, but when I was living here in my late teens, I was kind of outside of the city center. Buses took a long time to get into town, and my friend group wasn't very punk, which is fine. And then when I moved to Montreal, all of a sudden I found myself surrounded by people who were really into DIY. And I was like, oh my gosh, these people are making comics, they're in bands, they're like printing vinyl, they're screen printing, like everything was just like so hands-on, and I loved that. So that was a big inspiration to see what people were doing in that world. But then, through that, also just being in Montreal, John and Quarterly is based there, and I discovered their bookstore, and I found, all sorts of artists that I was really inspired by. So Julie Doucet, Joe Sacco, I really liked their things. Now, like currently, I really love Gillian Tamaki's work. So I was excited to find artists that were doing longer novels on, kind of more, I wouldn't necessarily say serious subject matter, but like really delving deep into whatever it was they were interested in. And that kind of opened my eyes to that being a possibility for me.
Absolutely. And I think you've translated quite well into your latest graphic novel, Hot to Trot. And for those not familiar with it, I wonder how you would describe that book to someone.
Describing my own work, I find a little challenging, but I'll give it a try. So, really, it's an adventure story. So, it's following two characters who are best friends as they kind of navigate their own interpersonal differences and conflicts while being on a big adventure together, going across the United States. So it includes, like hitchhiking, hopping trains, riding horses, meeting various people and all sorts of different landscapes. While at the same time, they're sort of trying to come to terms with the differences in their outlook on life and how to maintain their friendship, even though they're realizing that they see things very differently.
Okay. Yeah.
How would you describe it?
No, it's definitely the other thing too. I wanted to ask you about the audience for your book. It's far removed from Archie and Calvin Hobbes, although there are adult things in there. Yes, you can see it as an adventure story, but you've made some subtle sort of like as the characters are talking, they're actually criticizing their scenarios and each other. So I was curious to know who are you? I presume this is for an adult audience, of course, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more for an adult audience. So probably, over 18 would probably be the best. But really, I feel like late 20s and into 30s and older is probably gonna connect more with the storyline. I would say that's my audience, but I wonder about that because there are things in here that I thought maybe people would be interested in reading about, even if they've never personally experienced them. Like most people have never hopped trains, but it could be interesting to read about that, even though that's not something that most people would ever want to do. So, it's kind of definitely would be relatable to a lot of people who are sort of in that DIY punk countercultural world, but I think it could be approachable to a lot of people, really.
Right. So what messages do you hope readers take away from your book? You do say a lot of different things in your book, and as I said, a little bit of a criticism of the way society runs. Is there any message you want them to take away from that?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think there's a lot of different messages that you could take from it, but ultimately it's about two people trying to come to terms with caring for each other, even though they look at the world in very different ways. So I think a big message of the book is to open your mind to different perspectives, to accept change is necessary and often healthy, even though it's a really scary thing, and to not get necessarily too attached to a particular outcome in your life. I think people do have to be open to taking some risks, but also like following what feels right for them. So there's a lot of different messages there, especially between Yeva and Langosh. They're both trying to really heavily influence each other and convince each other that, their particular way of looking at things is the right way and maybe the only way. But in fact, there's a lot of different ways of looking at things, and you do have to follow what feels right to you, even though that might not be what your close friends or even other people in your life that you care about, they might not necessarily make those same choices.
Yeah, that's a healthy outlook. Hopefully, people pick up on that message, especially in this day and age. I think
Yeah.
it's universal, that's for sure. Now, I was
Mhm.
reading your bio, and it said that you've been exploring for 8 years. You did a
Mhm.
sort of a travel around Canada, America, and Eastern Europe. So,
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to know, how did those 8 years help you in creating this book?
Like, it would not have been possible if I hadn't done that. So, overall, I would say to any young person who wants to create a graphic novel or, any kind of storytelling, if they want to follow that as a path, beyond like absorbing other really good storytellers' work, like beyond reading a lot or like getting better at drawing or whatever it is, you need to have experiences in your own life that you can draw from for things to say. And so it was really the single thing, like those years of traveling were really the thing that created this book. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. So it was very important.
I wouldn't say it's semi-autobiographical, but there are certain points that you've pulled out of your experiences in travel that you've put into this book. Certainly, the scenery, perhaps some experiences. Is that true? There are
Yeah.
some things there.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything in the book is directly related to an event, a similar event that I experienced or a close friend of mine. So really none of it was like invented purely purely out of my own head. I really, really strongly drew from my own experiences for writing this.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk a wee bit about how you create your book. So, I wonder if you could talk about your tools and maybe your workflow as you create your art.
Yeah. Yeah, so the first book that I wrote in this series, Fugitive Days, that I did by hand. I was still like I'm fairly like new to the world of digital stuff. So the first one was all done by hand. And this one, I started drawing it just at the, kind of height of the pandemic. And I actually had a difficult time sourcing some of the materials that I wanted, physical materials. So I ended up getting an iPad and teaching myself how to use that to draw. And I ended up just doing the whole thing on the iPad. So this is my first project of me learning how to use digital tools. So this one was totally done digitally, which I was really, really like. I listened to old interviews of myself from like 2020 when I was doing everything by hand, and I was like, I don't think I'll ever transfer to digital. And then I completely did during the pandemic. And it's really different, but the advantages of it really like just drew me in terms of the cost of not having to buy all those materials. How many times with paper, like I accidentally spilled ink all over a page I just finished and then had to do it all over again. None of that anymore. So now, yeah, now I'm using Procreate, which is kind of a good introductory program for people who are just learning how to use digital tools.
Do you think you ever go back to traditional?
Well, I still like doing that sometimes, but the thought of doing a full length book again, I don't know. I would have to be pretty different. It would have to be like the only thing I could see drawing me into doing that again is if I decided to do it in a completely different method. Like if I was like, I'm going to paint it or I'm going to use, gouache or something like that and just completely like do something new. That would be a good reason to go back to physical stuff. But if I'm going to continue doing this type of work as it looks now, I think I'll just keep doing it on the iPad. Yeah.
I noticed from your bio that you're also into fine cabinetry, and I've seen you've done woodworking. Would it be safe
Mm.
to say that the digital experience doesn't necessarily replace traditional, but gives you the same feeling of accomplishment? Because I know with woodworking, you're using your
Mhm.
hands a lot, and you can actually see and touch and feel
Yeah.
your finished product. Whereas digital, it's kind of that sort of intangible thing. What do you
Mm.
say about that?
Yeah, I think that's really true. Thank goodness that I I have woodworking as an outlet for that because I'm a very tactile person. So I really enjoy doing woodworking, and it's a bit of a balance for me from sitting in front of my computer all day working on the book. I can go to the wood shop and I can actually do something with my hands, and I find that's very healthy for me. But for this book, because now it's printed and it's like a physical book, that kind of helps with that. If it was just going to remain digital, I don't think I would have the same experience of accomplishment or completion. But now that I actually have a physical copy of the book in front of me, it's like, oh, yeah, I really did all that. It's really real. I can see it all in one place. Whereas, 344 pages living in a file on my computer doesn't have quite the same feeling of accomplishment.
Right. Makes sense. Well, you've finished Hot to Trot. I'm wondering if you have any other up-and-coming projects that you can talk about.
Yeah. So, there's a couple of things. So I'm going to be doing a sequel to Hot to Trot, and that will take a few more years. Usually this one took me 2 years, so I'm hoping to finish the next one in about that same amount of time. So that's a little while down the line. But last year I got funding from the Shevchenko Foundation, which is a foundation that promotes Ukrainian Canadian culture. I'm Ukrainian Canadian myself, and so I was kind of inspired to do something along those lines. So I'm actually working on a children's book right now that is a bit of a celebration of Ukrainian culture and language. So that I'm finishing up this year, and I'm going to be looking for a publisher for that work. So that will be something coming down the line a little bit soon. Sequel.
Nice. Something to look forward to. Now, this question comes way out of left field, but I've been asking creators about the use of AI, especially when it comes to comic book creation. So I want to get your take. Do you think that AI is helpful or harmful to comic book creation?
Well, I would say potentially both. I definitely know that this is a hot button topic for a lot of people. Especially I've seen people in the illustration world who have, lost employment because they're working at a firm that is just fully transitioning to AI, and they're laying off a lot of their illustrators. So that concerns me. I'm concerned for people whose 9 to 5 is threatened by this technology. On the other hand, I think that AI would probably create, quite formulaic work. So I don't see it creating anything entirely original or different. And so I feel like there always like something that a human being could say or create that would be much more original and much more interesting and different. And I think that there's always an appetite for that. People like to have their comfort food and like watch their Marvel movies, which are always very formulaic and same. But I think there's always an appetite for something new and something different and something exciting. And that's where I don't think AI would necessarily have the capacity to create. So my hope lies in that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So with all the projects you have on the go, the currently and forthcoming, do you have a website that you recommend people go to find out more about your current and your future projects?
Yeah, that's a work in progress, but I am working on it. But at the moment, all I really have is an Instagram profile, which is Veronica Post Comics. So people can go there and they can see what I'm currently working on. I try to make posts fairly regularly to show people what's going on with me. And the website should be up and running in the next couple of months.
Very good. Well, yeah. Veronica, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Well, I guess that I just really hope that people would give this book a try. I think that it talks a lot about a lot of, different things, including lots of pertinent topics today. Like it touches on police brutality. It touches on how we deal with and process trauma, how harmful, abuses of power can kind of reverberate and ripple out and touch entire communities and families. And I think, without making too direct or telling people how they should feel about any particular thing, I think it gives people some food for thought on how, as a society, we decide to deal with what some would term problematic behavior. So I think that it could be interesting for anybody who's interested in those subjects, to take a look at.
Thanks to Veronica for the chat. You can discover more about Veronica on Instagram at veronica.post.comics. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube at True North Country Comics Videos. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. And remember, you can always send feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2023.